Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Nicholas. I feel I have two difficulties this morning. One is that I come at last after a long line of extremely competent and capable speakers. The other is that I was asked to talk about Colombia as seen from the UK. And I think outside this room, one is tempted to say the answer is almost invisible, certainly very distant, and really rather distorted. In their view of Colombia, or lack of view of Colombia, Britons are not alone. David Bushnell, a veteran American historian of Colombia, wrote a decade ago that of all the countries of Latin America, Colombia is, quote, the least studied and perhaps the least understood. It has become, as a questioner to the president this morning said, almost synonymous with cocaine and violence. If Colombians are lucky, some Britons might remember that Gabriel Garcia Marquez is a Colombian. But when it is mentioned at all in a political debate in this country, it's likely to be in the context of a selective reading of its human rights problems. And I would wager that 8 out of 10 Britons, if asked to spell Colombia, would spell it as the university in New York or the river in the Pacific Northwest. I'm ashamed to say that some of my colleagues do from time to time. I think there are a few signs that this invisibility is starting to change, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But first I have to deal with a third difficulty, which is what I thought I would do in the next few minutes is to offer a very brief interpretation of some of the main characteristics of Colombia, some of the issues it faces and its prospects. But I did not realize that I would be speaking to an audience of some of the main business people of Colombia who I might have expected to be speaking to in Bogota or Cartagena rather than in London. So I apologize that I'm not giving a talk about the main characteristics of Britain. I first started writing about Colombia, I first started visiting and writing about it in 1986, and I've been a frequent visitor. I think I've been back there at least once, almost every year since then. And I think the first thing that strikes any outside visitor to Colombia is that it's a complex and often surprising country, replete with paradoxes. You already know that it's the third largest Latin American country by population and the second by biodiversity. You might not know that more Colombian women work outside the home than those in any other Latin American country. It's a country with a strong cultural tradition, not just Garcia Marquez, but a crop of successful younger novelists whose work is starting to become available in translation in Britain. It's the country of origin of Fernando Botero, the most entrepreneurial and successful in market terms of Latin American visual artists. It's Latin America's biggest exporter of books, and its cities have many bookshops and public libraries. Cartagena is home to a classical music festival and a branch of the Hay Festival, the Hay Literary Festival, and here I must declare an interest and thank Pro Export for having invited me to appear at that festival last year. Second, for more than for most countries, geography has been destiny for Colombia. One study found that of anywhere in the world, its geography was the third most adverse for economic development. The Andes break into 3 chains broken by deep valleys. Much of the 2 coasts are backed by jungle, swamp, or semi-desert. The population is the most geographically dispersed of any Latin American country. No wonder that Colombia boasts the world's second oldest scheduled airline. Even today, urban legend has it, and I think it's true, that it costs more to transport a container from Bogota to Cartagena than from Cartagena to China. So that is why President Santos's ambitious plans to attract private investment to infrastructure projects are so important. These geographical factors combine to make Colombia both inward-looking, but also difficult to govern and to police. Colombia is also a largely mestizo country, though with important surviving populations of Amerindians and Afro-descendants. For much of its history, its social backbone was highland villages of small and medium-scale farmers, rather self-reliant people. So the third point is that all of this threw up a deep distrust, not just of authoritarianism, but of strong central government. As Malcolm Dees, the great British historian of Colombia, has pointed out, Colombia's 1899 Penal Code fixed as the penalty for assassinating the president a jail term of just 6 to 10 years, or 4 to 8 years if he was out of office at the time. It is a very, this background, of course, gave rise to a democratic tradition. The liberals and conservatives alternated in power with only one brief interlude of military rule in the 1950s. Very un-Latin American, you might think. It's a very Colombian paradox that the country is at once highly legalistic, but often lawless and prone to periods of political violence. This legalistic tradition is also why I always believed, and said so 2 years ago at an event like this, at which I think Sir Martin also spoke, that I believed that the Constitutional Court would not allow President Uribe to stand for a third term. Fourth, as a result of these traits, Colombia was peculiarly vulnerable both to the guerrilla warfare that characterized the Cold War in Latin America, and it offered ideal geographical and criminological conditions to become a base for the international drug trade. But why in Colombia, alone in Latin America, did guerrilla movements outlast the Cold War? I think there are 3 reasons, and the first concerns the nature of the FARC, the main guerrilla movement. Its leaders are dogmatic Stalinists with little understanding of the modern world. In 2001, during the failed peace talks, I sat down for 2 hours to talk to Alfonso Cano, who was then the political leader of the FARC and then became its overall commander. And I had had experience of similar conversations with guerrilla leaders from El Salvador and Guatemala. And I have to say that I was struck by the complete lack of any acceptance of democracy on the part of Cano. And so I was not surprised that the peace talks failed. The second, and perhaps bigger reason for the FARC's longevity is clearly its partial descent into organized crime and the ready existence of revenues from drugs and other criminal activities. But I think the third reason was also the growth of the paramilitary vigilantes of the extreme right during the 1970s and 1980s, which, in my view, was an enormous handicap to achieving peace in Colombia. These paramilitaries were another consequence of the weakness of the state and of the security forces in Colombia. Some were closely linked to drug traffickers, others to rural landowners threatened by the FARC. Some army officers and politicians collaborated with them. This was never the policy of the armed forces or government as institutions, but it served to weaken the legitimacy of the democratic state in Colombia, especially abroad. The upshot of all of this was that by the late 1990s, Colombia was in some ways close to becoming a failed state. The state of national gloom was exacerbated by the first recession to hit the country for half a century. But the past decade, as we've heard, has seen an extraordinary turnaround in Colombia. It began with the internationalization of the conflict under President Andrés Pastrana. Plan Colombia is routinely described as a failure. That is because it was sold, particularly to the American public, as a strategy to wipe out the drug trade, an impossibility. As a counterinsurgency strategy, it was a success. It went hand in hand with a huge national effort by Colombia. I think that history will judge that while President Uribe made some serious mistakes, especially in his handling of the paramilitaries and in his clashes with the courts, he also deserves enormous credit for leading this turnaround, which included the imposing of a wealth tax to finance a big and overdue build-up in the size and effectiveness of the security forces. The result is that today the FARC has been reduced from a strategic threat to the survival of Colombian democracy to a series of scattered, though still deadly, guerrilla bands. The paramilitaries have demobilized, though they have recycled themselves as criminal organizations. This brings me to the agenda facing President Santos today. And here I have a particular difficulty because he expounded it with such eloquence this morning. I think on security, it clearly involves consolidating gains and correcting mistakes. Above all, it means extending security right across this vast and geographically challenging country. That means a bigger emphasis on rural policing. It is the President's credit that with the law of victims, he is making a determined effort to reverse the violent and illegal agrarian counter-reform perpetrated by the paramilitaries over the past 2 decades. It also involves continuing vigilance in the preservation of human rights, including, of course, and fundamentally, the right to life and the right not to be kidnapped. One of the consequences of the internationalization of the conflict was greater scrutiny from abroad of human rights in Colombia. And I think the President rightly sees that as an opportunity as much as a problem. Security in the countryside is clearly intimately linked to the President's campaign promise of faster economic growth, more jobs, and greater prosperity. With greater security, Colombia can see the kind of agricultural revolution enjoyed by Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Peru in the past 2 decades. I think that Colombia is now poised for an economic takeoff of the kind enjoyed by Brazil over the past decade. It has always stood out in Latin America for eschewing economic populism. For half a century until 1995, the economy grew at a steady 5% a year, avoiding both recession and debt default. After dipping a decade ago, growth has edged up again over the past few years, as we heard from Luis Carlos. And I think it's, as he said, it's an important strength of Colombia that its economy is diversified in so many different ways, both in terms of sectors of production and in terms of geographical distribution in the country and in terms of export markets. Unlike Chile or Venezuela, it's not dependent on a single commodity. Colombia's geography may finally start being an asset, placed as it is at the junction of South and North America and with the Pacific coast facing Asia, and it now forms part of this trio of fast-growing Pacific countries in Latin America, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, which act as a counterpoint to Brazil in South America. But Colombia does face some so far unaddressed tasks. Unemployment may be coming down, but it remains high by regional standards given the level of growth, and that points to structural rigidities in the labor market. And so does the large number of Colombians who work in the informal economy. In education, Colombia ranks 4th out of the 8 Latin American countries that took place in the latest standardized set of tests conducted by the OECD. But all the Latin American participants in those tests ranked in the bottom third among the 65 countries taking part. And we have already referred this morning to the deficiency of transport infrastructure. I think the Santos administration clearly has ambitious plans to address many of these problems. It can go down in Colombian history as a great reforming government. Perhaps the biggest constraint is one mentioned by Sir Martin. One worries slightly about the pool of available talent, available not just to the private sector, but also to the government in Colombia, that I think needs expansion. To sum up, Colombia is changing fast and for the better. I think slowly that change is starting to percolate into international perceptions. A couple of years ago, I was surprised to find, for the first time, in a bookshop in Britain, a tourist guide to Colombia. It was a slim volume, I have to say. Since then, I've seen several more, and they're getting fatter. Last summer, I read in a British newspaper, in a guide to gap year destinations for British young people, that Bogota was the hottest place to go. And perhaps even more surprising, given how little my colleagues in other parts of the British press think about Colombia, I saw a story in the business pages of The Observer yesterday about the potential of the Colombian economy. There are always lags between realities and perceptions, but I do think that at last Colombia seems to be starting to come into clearer focus in Britain. Thank you very much.
Businessmen here, please correct me, are frightened of difficulties because difficulties are opportunities. How do we make Colombia fashionable as a fashionable destination for business?
Well, I think there are three reasons. I mean, I think the President was absolutely right this morning when he said that, perceptions are based in realities. And, realities have changed, they're still changing, there are still problems. But you have to change the realities to start changing the perceptions. The second point is that I think there are lags, and that that process of change is beginning. The third point is that Colombia is quite a long way away, and we no longer have any direct flights between non-stop flights between Britain and Colombia. I had to go and give a lecture in Cartagena last year. It actually took me the best part of 2 days to get there. Why is that? Well, I mean, business is always about priorities, isn't it? I mean, and if you've got bigger, more traditional markets closer to home, then you deal with them first. I think what's changed now is that many of those markets are not growing, and therefore, British companies, British governments, the British government are starting to look further afield in the world to Latin America because it's growing. But I think there's a missing infrastructure there, both in terms of transport and in terms of experience and in terms of familiarity. I think it is starting to come, but we're at the beginning of a process that will take a few years.
Thank you. Questions? There's one over there.
Alexander Kennedy of the British and Colombian Chamber of Commerce. I think that a government of national unity in Colombia is about as rare as a coalition government in this country. And both so far have had considerable benefits, particularly in Colombia. However, in this country, we still have something of an opposition. Do you, Michael, feel that the lack of a strong formal opposition in Colombia in the future could lead to a damaging of its democratic reputation?
I think that's a very good question. I mean, one only has to think back a few decades in Colombia to the governments of national unity, the pacted democracy that put an end to the civil war of the 1950s between the liberals and the conservatives. And indeed, when I first went to Colombia, governments routinely always had ministers from both parties in them. And that brought stability. It also brought certain problems in terms of a sense of democracy being for insiders. The 1991 Constitution, I think, solved those problems. I think, the fact that a leader of an opposition party has just been elected mayor of Bogota, the second most important job in the country, is important. I think it's, we'll see how good a mayor he is, but I mean, at least ex ante, I think it's in principle a good thing. I think the important thing is that, what do you have a government of national unity to do? You know, I worry in Brazil, for example, that Dilma Rousseff's coalition controls 400 out of the 513 seats of Congress, and yet the government is not moving forward with some unpopular but necessary moves, reforms such as a tax reform. I think, you know, we've heard that this government of national unity in Colombia is actually doing a lot. It's reforming a lot. You know, one would. I think it's a more natural state of affairs in a democracy for there to be a government and an opposition, and I imagine that Colombia will revert to that, but I hope it gets a lot of difficult and important stuff done first.
Thank you very much. Question over there, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Jairo Rojas. I was born in Colombia. I left Colombia probably almost 40 years ago. So I've been very pleased to see what has happened today. But in the 70s and middle of the 80s, I had to spend most of my time as an ambassador of Colombia, although I was in business and technology business, trying to tell the world that there was a country called Colombia and that it was spelled with an O and not with a U. Then in the 80s, beginning of the 90s, I had to persuade people that it was possible that a Colombian could be selling technology and not drugs. And now that I've seen the growth of what Colombia is doing, especially since Ambassador Rodriguez arrived here, who has been involved in a lot of Colombians who have been here for many years, we're starting to hear wonderful stuff about our country, which probably we forgot about it. And my fear is that the press and the image of Colombia, and particularly Hollywood, is going to continue keeping that image because it actually sells more movies and it sells more papers. Yeah. And therefore, my question to you is, how could Colombia, and us Colombians who are ambassadors outside of the country, help to change that image? I know that actions will speak, but I think we need to do a little more about persuading other countries and the media and the ones who control the image of our country that it's more than Escobar. You know, I'm glad we have Shakira and Montoya and Garcia Marquez. So if you could advise us on that, how we can help with that.
Well, you've given me an opportunity for a commercial, I'm afraid, in the sense that all I can say is that, you know, we sell 1.6 billion copies a week of The Economist around the world because we try and tell people about realities rather than, and we try and change their perceptions if those perceptions are wrong. So I think at the end of the day, readers are not stupid, and they will be interested if realities are changing. But it's true that you know, stereotypes are hard to shake off. I think that, you know, provided the realities have changed, you know, then Colombia can do more to promote itself. I think it's about time you had a professional foreign service, and that is not in any way to criticize or denigrate some of the we have an extraordinarily capable Colombian ambassador in Britain at the moment, but I think you pay a price for not having a deeper structure of a career foreign service. I've never quite, perhaps I have understood why you don't have it. I'm more surprised that you haven't changed it over the last 10 years or so and set one up, because having sort of pensioned off politicians as ambassadors is not necessarily the best way to sell the country to the world. So that's one concrete suggestion.
As a career diplomat, I was very pleased to hear you say that, Michael. But just picking up on the ambassadorial point as each Colombian, and the President this morning was talking that he'd just come on from Turkey and drawing some parallels there. Turkey's reputation in the Middle East had been coloured somewhat by its close association with Israel, which has now got slightly more fractures. But apparently what has done most for its transformation in the Middle East is the huge popularity of a Turkish soap opera that has been exported in the way that television soap operas are throughout the Middle East. And they're all seeing how Turkey really works. Are there some film and television producers out there in the audience about to turn in a Colombian soap opera that will grip British viewers and transform the way that we think about Colombia? Are you out there?
Ugly Betty, no? Ugly Betty, no? Betty La Fea. Very famous Colombian soap opera, but it got remade in Hollywood, I think, didn't it? But I'm sure there will be others.
We have a question over there, or somebody volunteering to write a soap opera. This is tremendous. Thank you.
I'm not volunteering to write a soap opera. I've got a serious question. I chair a public company. My name is Giles Clark, Amerisol Resources. Our activities are in Colombia. I was very disappointed that there was no FT special report on Colombia to coincide with the state visit. Indeed, very surprised. And since you talk about covering Colombia, for those of us who seek to raise money for exercises, for investing in Colombia from city investors, having a report in the FT when the president comes here is actually quite important. And that's something I would look, actually, if I may, to UKTI to ask them why that hasn't happened.
Well, I have to say that although Pearson hold 50% in The Economist, it's not a controlling stake. We're an independent company, and the FT are our competition. So I suggest you address your complaint to them rather than to us.
But it prompts another thought. We've heard about how the Colombian economy has been transformed. We've heard all the wonderful opportunities that are there. We've also heard about the rapid increase in British trade with Colombia. We know about the level of British investment in Colombia. Is it that, in fact, the transformation in the business relationship has already perhaps taken place, and it's just the statistical lag to prove the point that is not quite caught up with us yet?
I mean, I think in terms of perceptions, I think that Latin America has been changing fundamentally in the last 10 to 15 years. But I think many people in this country, in business, or in Europe in general, in the US, only woke up to that after Lehman Brothers because of the need to seek other opportunities. I have picked up over the last couple of years that Colombia has suddenly become talked about as an investment destination. These things tend to go in waves, right? In which the first wave is financial investors or private equity or funds or whatever, and then you start having more established manufacturing or service companies going in. And I do think that process has very much started with Colombia from Britain. It's clearly got further to go.
And I think as the minister, our minister, UK Minister for Trade, made clear this morning, with the relative lack of growth in our British traditional export markets, there is no alternative but to go for the high growth markets. We've heard the figures, we've seen the figures, we've seen the reality of the opportunities, we know the costs. Business will write in their margins, but if businesses survive, then high growth markets such as Colombia will be absolutely critical. You touched very briefly on the gap year, and I met in the coffee break a young man doing his GCSEs in Canterbury at the moment, on the debating team already at that particular school, and wondered where we were going the other way to get our young people engaged. And perhaps it is something as simple as encouraging people to travel when their minds are still relatively open, and informing their experience before we go on to become entrepreneurs, civil servants, diplomats, or just in our institutions and banks and and the like. But that's a hope for the future. Michael, thank you very much indeed for talking to us today, for drawing on your vast experience to encourage us to think about how best we might take the opportunities that are here today, even in the absence of an FT special supplement. But you referred to the Observer remarks yesterday. thank you very much indeed for being with us today.